Hey everyone, welcome to the Holy Post. A new chatbot based on OpenAI is claiming to have a biblical worldview and invites users to ask questions directly to the Apostle Paul. Is this a helpful tool or just another step closer to replacing Christian community with artificial intelligence? Speaking of community, a new article in The Atlantic says 40 million Americans have stopped attending church because our culture is addicted to work and no longer values community. But is it all the culture's fault, or does the church also carry some blame? Then Washington Post columnist Christine Emba is back to discuss her new report about the masculinity crisis. She says that voices on the far right are engaging men with a message of misogyny and anger, while voices on the far left aren't bothering to engage men at all. Is there a way out of this crisis? And also this week, toxic zombie worms. Before we get into it, our Holy Post pundit, Dr. Amy Peeler, who's also a New Testament professor at Wheaton College, has written a brilliant theological review of the Barbie movie. And if you haven't read it yet, it's available to everyone on the Holy Post website. But we've got something exclusively for Holy Post Plus subscribers as well. Caitlin Chess has interviewed Dr. Peeler about the theological themes in the Barbie movie. That bonus interview is now available only to Holy Post Plus subscribers. To learn more about how you can join Holy Post Plus and get access to all of that content, along with shows like Christian Asks, Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess, the Holy Post Book Club, live streams, free merchandise, and a whole lot more, go to our website, holypost.com. Okay, here is episode 576. Hey everybody, welcome to the Holy Post. I am Sky Jatani. Joining me is Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Sky.
You are joining us from a undisclosed location?
From California, where my parents live.
Yeah, where exactly in California?
Well, I'm not going to give you their address, but, well, actually, it's very safe because it's on a military base in the Central Coast.
Oh, okay.
Nice. And that other voice you're hearing is not Phil Vischer.
Yep.
Phil is taking a week off for other important tasks. So we asked good friend, Holy Post pundit, and host of the Voxology podcast, Mike Erie, to join us. Hi, Mike.
Hi. I'm glad to be here. I know it's big shoes to fill. That's the third time I've made that joke, and the first time it's made it on the episode. So
I need to teach you the concept of diminishing returns, Mike.
I still like it, though.
Caitlin, it's up for you. Listen, everybody, Caitlin Chess, come for the hot theological takes, stay for the children's sermon anecdotes. Okay? That's all I'm going to say.
Yes.
All right, well, with that, here's the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Caitlin.
Today's episode is sponsored by Sundays. This is Phil. I have a dog. You have a dog. We love our dogs, and we gotta feed them something. Fresh food with human-grade ingredients is a better way to treat our dogs than that old bag of whatever that stuff is. Sawdust and cow bones? I have no idea. But fresh pet food is expensive and inconvenient, and that's where Sundays comes in. No, not the day. The new dog food company that makes air-dried dog food from a short list of human-grade ingredients. It's healthy, with beef, chicken, and digestive aids like pumpkin and ginger. It's convenient. Unlike other fresh dog foods, it's zero prep, zero mess, and zero stress. Sundays is shelf-stable and ships right to your door. And it's affordable, costing 40% less than other healthy dog food brands because they don't waste money shipping frozen packages. We've got a special offer for our dog-loving Holy Posters. Get 35% off your first order of Sundays. Go to sundaysfordogs.com/holypost or use the code HOLYPOST at checkout. That's sundaysfordogs.com/holypost. Upgrade your pup to Sundays and feel good about the food you feed your dog. And thanks to Sundays for sponsoring this episode.
Okay, before we get into the serious stuff, we have animal news.
Oh!
Excited for this? I have two stories, two animal news stories that are related to each other.
Okay.
These could also fall under the category of what could possibly go wrong.
Yeah. I just could tell this wasn't about to be cute, fuzzy animal stories.
It's not cute and it's not fuzzy. First headline comes from the Washington Post. Toxin-secreting hammerhead worms are invading the D.C. area. As if
That's
watching.
Yeah,
true,
every
but
year.
But what about the animals?
That's right. Talk about drain the swamp, right? And like
Yeah,
snakes
that's
and all
good.
that.
That's good,
okay.
yeah.
Here's from the story. The hammerhead flatworm slithers like a snake and resembles a piece of whole wheat spaghetti, led by its mushroom-shaped head, and it also secretes tetrodotoxin, the same debilitating neurotoxin found in pufferfish. The hammerhead worm is an invasive flatworm from Asia, probably spreading to many new locations through the exporting of exotic plants. And research shows the genus has spread across the world, especially along the east coast of the United States.
Wow.
Okay, here's the good news. This is a quote. The good news is that the worm isn't a threat to humans unless ingested or handled. So basically,
Okay.
you're
Okay.
fine if you don't touch it or eat
Yep.
it.
Yep.
Does
Can
that make
use
you
it
feel
for
better?
fishing? Can you use it for fishing?
Well, only if you don't have to touch it.
Okay, I
Okay.
just Googled this, and the first
Yeah.
thing that came up was from NPR, if you see a hammerhead worm, remember, salt, don't slice.
Yeah, that
So
okay.
they have to
There
have
it is.
advice about how to
Yep.
get rid of them.
That's
Yep.
part of the article I wanted. This is creepy. The worms can't be cut because the fragments will reproduce into additional hammerhead worms.
Like the Terminator.
Yeah, like
Yes.
Hydra. So if you cut them up, I don't know why you'd cut them up, but if you cut them up, they just
Yeah.
multiply. Oh, okay. It gets worse. They carry this neurotoxin, which it irritates your skin if ingested in large enough quantities. It'll paralyze you. And they carry parasitic nematodes that can be dangerous to pets if ingested. Hammerhead worms are ferocious hunters of other invertebrates and are often much larger than they are, including earthworms, snails, and slugs. They've been observed crawling on an earthworm, rubbing their head over the earthworm, at which stage scientists think the hammerheads are using their toxin, because shortly after, the earthworm becomes less mobile. Then the hammerhead worm secretes digestive enzymes and sucks the liquefied tissue of the worm into its gut. When digestion is complete, the worm's mouth also reverses its use and serves as its anus. So it's also news of the butt. I have a trifecta here.
Oh my gosh.
Well done, Sky. That's
Thank you.
fantastic.
Okay, to make things even worse, this is a headline from CNN. A worm has been revived after 46,000 years in the Siberian permafrost.
What could go wrong?
Right.
What could possibly go wrong?
Scientists have revived a worm that was frozen 46,000 years ago. The roundworm of a previously unknown species survived 40 meters, that's 131.2 feet, below the surface in the Siberian permafrost in a dormant state known as cryptobiosis. Organisms in cryptobiotic state can endure the complete absence of water or oxygen and withstand high temperatures, as well as freezing or extremely salty conditions. They remain in a state, quote, between death and life. These are 40,000-year-old zombie worms.
Dude.
No, thank you.
That sounds like the beginning of the next, plague.
Exactly.
I'm done with
That
worms.
whole
No
intro.
worms.
And
No.
it gets worse. It gets worse because the scientists who are studying these are from some very shady Russian institution. And one of the researchers, whose name is Anastasia, which ironically means resurrection in Russian.
What?
Yeah, one of the researchers revived 2 of the worms at the institute by simply rehydrating them with water, before taking around 100 worms to labs in Germany for further analysis, transporting them in her pocket.
This does sound like a movie. That sounds like a
does.
movie.
Totally
Yep.
sounds like a movie.
Yep.
After thawing the worms, the scientists used radiocarbon analysis to establish that the deposits had not been thawed since between 45 and 47,000 years ago. This is an unknown species of worm that's been frozen for over 40,000 years that was revived by just making them wet and then transporting them across the world in some lady's pocket.
No.
Yeah. This, I don't think the world will end because of malice. I think the world will end just by stupidity. I mean, more than anything else. I'm going to carry it in my pocket. I'm going to touch, who knows what germs it's shedding. I'm just going to touch things, have it in my pocket. It's fine, not to worry. And then on the other side, we've got the hammerheads. So there was a movie, Caitlin, this is so before your time, but it was about flesh-eating worms. It was a horror movie. It was like a B-rated horror movie called Squirm. Yes, and it was about worms that would kind of like fill up your house. Yeah, very good. I would check it out for kind of its historical details. Yep, really,
Caitlin,
really great.
You like young children, right?
Yes.
I'm sure.
Yes.
I'm sure you have observed young children, babies, toddlers, whatever, and they're just exploring the world, and they get their hands into all kinds of really gross.
And they put
stuff,
everything in their mouth.
and they put everything in their mouth, and they're doing it innocently. They're just dumb, right?
Yeah. Well,
Well, like they don't know.
they're
better.
developing.
But they could ingest bad things. They don't know to
Yeah.
wash their hands. They don't
Yeah.
distinguish.
They haven't
between...
learned yet.
Right. Exactly. We like to think that as we age, we mature and we learn and we grow beyond that behavior. But when I read stories like this about scientists who are thawing primordial zombie worms and carrying around the world in their pockets, I feel like we're just toddlers goofing off in a world that we don't fully understand. And to Mike's point, we are going to destroy ourselves because we're just toddlers who are putting stupid things in our mouths that don't know what we're doing.
Dude, way to wrap all that up, Scott. That was amazing. You checked every box imaginable.
Thank you. Wow. This has been Animal News, News of the Butt, and what could possibly go wrong, all rolled into one. Everyone is welcome. Okay, next story.
Yes.
This
Thank
comes
you.
from Religion News Service, and the title of the article is Meet the Christian Creators Designing Chatbots with a Biblical Worldview. Okay,
Yeah.
so there's this
that
guy,
sounds awesome.
Nils Gundbranson.
I don't trust anyone named Nils, first of all.
You're doing
I'm
a
just gonna
good
throw that out.
Phil impression by just not knowing how to say people's names.
Yeah, there's Nils Gilbranson. He's 23 years
Gilbranson?
old. 23.
Yeah.
I
That's
wouldn't
younger
trust
than
them to
even
do
Caitlin.
anything.
Yeah. He's created a website called BibleMate.io. First of all,
It could be a
BibleMate.
dating app. Could be a
Exactly.
dating
Doesn't
app,
it
too.
sound? It's either a dating app or
Yep.
like an Australian Bible site. But
Or
it's
guessing the end date.
BibleMate,
Oh, date, not mate.
not
I thought you
date.
said Bible date.
BibleMate.
Bible mate. Okay, that's bad.
So they asked Nils Gilbertson what's the big difference with ChatGPT, and he says it's grounded in a biblical and theological view of the world. The chatbot relies on an ever-growing database of sermons, books, and academic articles to inform the answers that it offers.
I'm sorry. Caitlin's face is the most amazing. I'm sorry. I'm not listening to the words, Sky. I'm watching Caitlin's face for approval and disapproval cues, and she's unhappy with this. Okay, let me just.
Well, this is
keep
a
going.
direct threat to her vocation.
Keep going. Keep going.
No, I don't think it is.
Okay. So Gilbertson Sunden says there's a number of uses for BibleMate.io in a church context. For pastors doing sermon research, for church
Yes.
volunteers drafting a Bible study, for curious teens like he once was who want to go deeper into youth group, but he also hopes non-Christians will use the chatbot for their own questions about God. He pointed to one of his favorite features, which he calls the explain it to me like I'm a 5-inch tool. No. It was explain it to me like I'm 5. I saw 5.
Yep. That's a close quote, Sky.
Wait,
That's a close quote right there.
It says 5 and then there's a quote, so I thought it meant 5-inch, like it's the inch abbreviation, and then the next word is tool, so I
Yeah.
a 5-inch tool, but explain it to me like I'm 5, not 5-inch tool. It's a tool called explain it to me like I'm 5. So you type in a hard theological question, you say explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old, and it does that. The goal is to give responses rooted in unwavering biblical truth, he says.
Yes. And
And-
everyone agrees on that.
Yeah, this is what I want to talk to you about. To generate the responses, it draws from respected scholars in this database, and he cites William Craig Lane and C.S. Lewis. Of course, Gilbertson acknowledges that not every Christian agrees on just what is biblical truth. So, is this a case of like garbage in, garbage out, or
Ooh.
treasure in, treasure out, where it all depends on what sources it's drawing from? Caitlin, you're shaking your head like this is a bad thing.
Look at the face. Look at the face.
Okay, can I get really nerdy for just like a second? Mm-hmm. Because I really think that this is kind of the end of a long road of an interest that we have had in turning the Bible into just straight up data that we can just plug into a bunch of equations and pop, there comes the answer. When I was reading we were talking earlier today, Sky, but I read a ton of rapture fiction from like the mid to late 20th century. And it's interesting to me how often this like interest in just putting the Bible into a computer comes up from the very earliest computers we had. It was like, just an obsession with, okay, obviously the computer will tell us the right answers. There's one novel in particular from the 70s where the rapture happens and the prime minister of Israel recruits a bunch of computer programmers to try and explain end times to him by just putting the Bible into a computer. And of course, dispensationalism pops out. But it's just like this interest in the Bible is data that we can just analyze like data. And it even goes back further than this. I mean, the very beginning of kind of print culture in the US, a lot of the stuff that was being printed was not just a bunch of different Bibles. It was concordances. It was putting Bible data into visual representations. There was all this interest in, you don't need to read the Bible. You need to read this book that kind of gives you charts or maps or graphs and just kind of explains it all to you. And concordances, even that concept, that's so familiar to us, but that's not always been true that we put data like that. Like you just look up a word, bam, there's all the verses. And I think at the heart of this is a misunderstanding of how faithful biblical interpretation happens. It happens in community. It happens by asking questions about what God would have us do here and now with the particular demands of the place and time we're in. It requires reliance on the Holy Spirit. Like it's a lot messier and contextual than just put a bunch of data into a computer and it pops out the answer. And I would fear something like this. While it might have limited good uses, the problem is not just what information is put into the thing, which is a really important question, whose interpretation matters. I think more importantly, it trains us to treat Scripture like just a book full of data instead of a story that we have to be captivated by, that we have to interpret in community, that we have to submit ourselves to what God is showing us in it. Like that's a very different orientation to Scripture than I stand over Scripture and I piece it out into data points and I pop out the right answer. And then no one can really argue with me because that's the answer the data came.
So you're saying that this is sort of the natural endpoint of modernity.
Yeah.
And its approach to Scripture.
And it's bad. That's not how we're supposed to read the Bible.
So even if it gives you what we may all consider to be an orthodox, theologically accurate answer, the system in itself is broken.
I think it really distorts our general posture towards Scripture. I don't think it cultivates in us the right kind of approach to studying Scripture.
So Mike, as a Bible teacher, you've been a Bible teacher as long as I've known you. You teach the Bible on your podcast. You teach in the pulpit. Is something like a quote-unquote biblical chat GPT a tool, a 5-inch tool that you would ever that you would ever utilize in your sermon prep and your research? I mean,
so good.
why yes or no?
Okay, great question, Sky. I am with Caitlin, and I hate answering after her because she steals always the best stuff and says it better than I ever could. Secondly, no, I tend to think that preaching is a communal and community-centered practice.
Oh, really?
So
there's not just one guy up in the pulpit?
Shocking. I know. One of the things we've been doing is like we leave, like I'll teach for maybe 25 minutes, and then we leave 20 minutes for questions. And that has totally changed the sermon, the church, the worship. I mean, it's been...
And are those questions answered or responded to by you? Or
yeah.
Okay.
Or with a big I don't know. But I mean,
yeah.
sometimes people will jump on other things. But the idea, is, hey, we're not trying to set up some authoritative Moses figurehead. We're a community of co-learners. And so if you approach preaching from that perspective, it's not an information dump, which is what I used to think it was. The phrase chatbots with a biblical worldview, that's the phrase I objected to because, Sky, when you and I were doing apologetics, the goal was to convince people of a biblical worldview. And what worldview reduced to was a set of mental assent to truth propositions. And here are the reasons why I would agree with those. And I now see that as one of the most unhelpful concepts. And I'm with Caitlin in the sense that the medium can't help but cancel out the message. And I think there's no getting around that. So first, I would never use it for preaching. I would feel like that would be sidestepping my responsibility as a pastor to know people, know the culture, study the text in a way that affects me, not reflecting someone else's work. But secondly, the goal of said preaching or church life can't be a biblical worldview. It's got to be something much deeper and richer and truer than that. So for those reasons, I would say, thank you, Nils. What a great idea. But if we're at a point, and we'll get to this in the next article, if we're at a point where 5-year-olds can't ask questions of their parents or in churches, and not, then we have much bigger problems than, a chat bot or whatever. So no, I'm not a fan.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with both of you here. I don't know if you actually went to the website. Did you go to BibleMate.io?
No, I have accountability software. And so, no, I didn't.
Well, here, this wasn't in the article, in the Religion News Service article, but when you actually go to the website, I think one of the things I found a little bit off-putting about it is, like, there's a headline on the website that says, "What if you could ask a question to Paul?" And then when you type in your question, like, how do I become more Christ-like? It responds as Paul of Tarsus or St. Paul. Like, and like they have a cartoon, they have a cartoon headshot of Paul and he's saying, ask me anything. Or so it's a little bit like, I think you're overstepping the boundaries of authority there when you're claiming to speak for Paul or Isaiah or whatever biblical character you want, maybe even Jesus. You can put words in Jesus' mouth in this case. Totally. But I think that's a little creepy.
And it raises the question we started with, which is, according to whose definition is this biblically orthodox? So, I mean, he mentions two white men. Okay. Is that all there is? Is it only Western people? Is it only, I mean, all the things we would be naturally sensitive to these days. I don't know that a 23-year-old is unless there's a lot of help, is equipped to really appreciate the breadth and depth of the Christian tradition in any way that would do it justice.
So I think what this chat thing, this Bible Mate chat thing does is it challenges us to think through what is the right employment of technology in our lives and in the church. Because it seems like there's some technology that augments or facilitates relationship or facilitates community. And then there's technology designed to replace those relationships or that community. I haven't given deep thought to this, but like I think of a telephone, not a smartphone, but just like an old world telephone as technology that augments or facilitates relationship. Like I can be across the country and pick up a phone and call my wife and check in on how things are going or whatever. And then there's technology that seeks to replace that relationship. Same thing with the church. Like, it's one thing to say, books are technologies. Like, I have books that help me understand the Bible better, but I still need my community to engage Scripture and live it out and incarnate it. Whereas it feels a little bit like this ChatGPT Bible thing is an excuse to not go to my community and ask a question, but to just sit alone with a computer and ask all of my deep theological questions alone, rather than having to engage in the wisdom and maturity of generations ahead of me that have lived with Christ and figured out faith. And like, that's a whole different thing than just typing a question into an artificial intelligence. Am I onto something there?
I mean, it sounds kind of like, I love Andy Crouch talks about the difference between what facilitates creativity and what puts you in the position of consumption. And I do think, I just pulled it up and made an account. I actually asked it what it means to be, I asked John the Apostle what it means to be a woman. And because I just thought, that'll tell me how I feel about a lot of it. And honestly, it was a good answer. Like, I really liked the answer that popped out. It gave a lot of good scriptural references. It really focused on Jesus elevating women and like ultimately it means to be made in Christ. And like what he really focused less on gendered specifics and more on a relationship with Jesus. So I loved that. But I was thinking about this in relationship to like the Bible software I use, which I use a lot to have a bunch of different translations open, to have access to a lot of commentaries that aren't just like filling up my shelves, to use different things to look at words across different portions of scripture. And I do think one of the differences there is that the software is oriented to creativity. Like, you have to do your own work. You have to look at all these different resources. And to your point, Sky, it actually, even though it's not physical books, it puts me in the mindset of realizing I'm drawing on the wisdom of all these different people. I have 20 tabs open and I'm kind of pulling it together. I'm thinking through it together, versus the whole way that this is set up is I put a question in, it pops out an answer. The work is not there. The community is not there. It really is oriented towards my consumption, not my creativity. And I do think that matters in general with technology. Like, are we doing more consuming than creativity? But I think especially when it comes to interpreting scripture, again, this goes back to like the posture thing. Like, do I think that the best way to read the Bible is to be in this posture of just consuming? That I will also probably translate that, like Mike said, to my pastor. Oh, I just consume, just give me the thing. Not, oh, this is interesting, and I read this other thing, and what do you think about that? And how does that all interact and work together?
Totally.
I think that's a question to ask, not just of this specific thing, which I think is easy for us to kind of giggle at because of the biblical worldview thing. And, my initial reaction is just negative. But I think there's probably other tools that I could be more tempted to use that I should ask that question of is this oriented towards my consumption or towards creativity?
That's such a great question. Go ahead.
Here's the other dynamic is, I think what you just experienced is probably a really good example, Caitlin. You put a question in and you actually liked the answer. Like it was orthodox, theologically nuanced, whatever. So maybe you could create an algorithm and an artificial intelligence that always gives you the right theological orthodox answer. Fine. What's missing there is they give an example in the article of asking this chatbot, what's the biblical view of marriage, or what does the Bible say about gay marriage, or something like that. I remember years ago, a woman came to me and she pretty much asked exactly that question. What is the Christian view of marriage? But as she was sitting across from me, I could tell there was an energy behind her question that was more than what she was asking.
Yeah.
And so rather than just spit out a theological answer or a Bible verse, or even maybe I would have given the same answer that the chatbot did, I could tell there was something else going on here. So I asked a deeper question, which is, well, what's driving you to ask this question in the first place? She had a son who was gay, and she was wrestling with that whole thing. And so the conversation was much less about theology and Bible, and it was far more about her relationship with her son. And I think I was given a little bit of pastoral wisdom, human intuition, or maybe guidance from the Holy Spirit to acknowledge the deeper reality that this woman was carrying into the conversation. And I don't believe that's something an artificial intelligence or an algorithm can do.
Yeah.
And
Well, that's the point.
right.
Is that the word becomes flesh. That's the movement of the Bible, is that the word becomes flesh or infleshed. And that nuance that we call pastoring, right, or listening or whatever, there's something about the discipleship, process. I mean, I've found in churches now, and I know you guys know this, but people come fully formed in their views on things. It's not like, hey, I've studied the Bible on this issue, but culture has convinced me of this position, and I come to the Bible with that position, and I'm asking the question in order to either be affirmed in my belief in that position, or to know that I don't have to trust you or be in a relationship with you if you give the wrong answer.
Right.
So answers now serve a different purpose than learning. Answers serve almost a partisan or tribal kind of issue. And it's exactly, Caitlin, what you described, right? I would want to know that too. Like, well, what do you think about divorce? What do you think about gay people or whatever? And I would have an expectation for a certain kind of answer. And it almost seems like that we need to be discipled away from that whole way of thinking about Bible, Christianity, life of the Spirit, church, before we could handle, answers so that are given so easily, because they just, all it does is reinforce existing prejudices. It's not like we're actually being transformed by the information that's being given.
Yeah.
And what you did is you invited somebody into transformation, right? The question behind the question. And that's, man, that just doesn't happen. Most churches aren't set up for that. And I the number of people I come across who just say, I'm never allowed to ask questions. So I could see where something like this would be interesting and attractive. And I'm all for, like, whether it's Bible Project or whatever, making deep truths accessible to people. But I really do think you're onto something when it comes to This is not the new humanity that Jesus died to create. This is not the social order that's to be a prophetic counter narrative, that we just are people with right answers.
Amen. Okay, let's go to the big story, which is related to this question of community and church and what does it all mean. This comes from The Atlantic. Now, I'm always intrigued when a big secular outlet like the New York Times or The Atlantic or, pick your outlet, has a story about Christianity or the church, because it's always like, you always want to like buckle up. What are they going to get right? What are they going to get wrong? This one I found really fascinating. So it's an article by Jake Meador. Meador.
You're killing it, dude. You're killing it with names today.
Meador.
Keep going.
The title is "The Misunderstood Reason Millions of Americans Stopped Going to Church." I mean, that's a big promise that they're going to tell me why millions of Americans haven't gone to church. Okay. 40 million Americans have stopped attending church in the past 25 years. That's something like 12% of the population, and it represents the largest concentrated change in church attendance in American history. In case you hadn't figured that out, a lot of people are feeling this. Like, there's data that backs up, it's there. He says that this change is bad news for America as a whole, because participation in a religious community generally correlates with better health outcomes and longer life, higher financial generosity, and more stable families, all of which are desperately needed in a nation with rising rates of loneliness, mental illness, alcohol, and drug dependency. So you have these perfect storm kind of things going on where America is more lonely, more unhealthy, more depressed, more anxious, and apparently part of congregational life brings some relief to all of those issues. At the same time, a record number of Americans are giving up on congregational life. So then he cites this new book written by Jim Davis and Michael Graham. Davis is an evangelical pastor in Orlando. Graham is a writer with the Gospel Coalition. The book is called The Great De-Churching. Have either of you happened to have seen that or read that?
No. I've seen it summarized and reviewed.
Okay, I have not read it, so this is kind of my first exposure to it. So the Great De-Churching finds that religious abuse and more general moral corruption in churches have driven people away. That's usually the explanation I bump into. It's like, the church is corrupt, there's abuse, there's all this terrible stuff going on. And they acknowledge that. But he goes on to say, Davis and Graham also find that a much larger share of those who have left church have done so for more banal reasons. The book suggests that the defining problem driving out most people who leave is just how American life works in the 21st century. Contemporary America simply isn't set up to promote mutuality, care, or common life. Rather, it is designed to maximize individual accomplishment as defined by professional and financial success. Such systems leave precarious little time or energy for forms of community that don't contribute to one's own professional life or, as one ages, the professional prospects of one's children. Workism reigns in America, and because of it, community in America, religious community included, is a math problem that doesn't add up. So if I'm interpreting what he's saying correctly, and his interpretation of the Great De-Churching book is arguing that we're just workaholics as a culture. And as we strive towards more money and more professional success, either for ourselves or for our children, there's no room left for community life like the sort required for a church. The book shows, as a quote, the book shows that for most Americans who were once part of churches but have since left, the process of leaving was gradual. And then he gives kind of different examples of what this looks like. And they eventually find that to attend rather than skip is easier. It's challenging for many people in their lives. They're stretched like a rubber band that's about to snap, and church attendance ends up feeling like an item on a checklist that's already too long. So they prioritize everything else, and adding church into that is too much. So there's a couple different things going on here. One is they're arguing Americans are too busy. I'm surprised that the article didn't get into youth sports because that's a favorite boogeyman. But we're too busy and we're too driven by our careers, and we don't know how to do community anymore. So before I go on in the article, because then he turns a corner to talk about what's the right solution to this, do you guys agree with that general assessment? You're both very involved in churches. You've both been on staff at churches. Mike, you're currently a pastor of a church. Does this ring true to you, or do you think he's missing something?
Could I go first? So Caitlin,
yeah, you're just ready to burst, Mike.
I am, because I wrote down. So I love this. I print out these articles and I write notes in margins, And contemporary America simply isn't set up to promote mutuality, care, or common life. Neither is the church. Rather, it is designed to maximize individual accomplishment as defined by professional and financial success. Exactly what the church does. I mean, I'm not reading this as a critique of the American culture. I'm reading this as a critique of the American church. Like, theologically, and I know it's easy to do this, but theologically, the problem is never outside God's people. Theologically, the problem is always internal, right? The great thrust of the New Testament isn't about how bad the world is or how corrupt the world is. It's about the purity and fidelity of the church in the face of those cultural pressures.
He says
gets
this.
there.
He gets
Yeah.
there.
He gets there.
Let me give you one other quote. He says, the tragedy of American churches is that they have been so caught up in the same world that you're describing of American culture that we now find they have nothing to offer these suffering people that can't be more easily found somewhere else. That's the
Right.
critique you're making, right, Mike?
Yes, absolutely. I didn't know we were going to bring other quotes in from further in the article. So I was jumping on, my initial reaction was, contemporary America simply isn't set up to promote mutuality, care, or common life. And I'm like, yep, that's exactly right.
And neither is the church.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Before you go on, though, I do want to kind of point out an internal contradiction in this article. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with any of those points. But again, earlier, he said that data shows participation in religious community generally correlates with better health outcomes, longer life, higher financial generosity, more stable families. So can you have it both ways? Can you argue the church itself is just as lost as the culture, but being involved in the church creates healthier people and better lives and more well-being?
Yeah.
I mean, I read it as saying that used to be more true. Like, not just because the church is so much better, but because we used to live lives that were more rooted in a particular community. And there were expectations. And I'm glad some of those expectations are gone, of just like, well, my parents were Christians, I'm a Christian, we go to church. Like, I'm glad that some of that is true. But I do think it facilitated some of this more stable community life. Whereas, like, I mean, all of my friends my age have lived multiple places around the country before they're 30. They don't live where their parents are. They're waiting longer to have kids, sometimes partially because they don't live in a broader community that they feel can help care for them financially or with the needs of a child. Like, I do think that that's been a larger shift in American culture. And then that's been reflected in the church. It's so difficult, I think, a lot of the time, because on one hand, some of those changes are really positive. Like, people feel glad that they aren't bound to the kind of cultural norms of the community that they were in that weren't necessarily biblical. And I celebrate that too. The difficult thing is, I don't think it's good for us to just have all choice all the time about everything we might want, career-wise, family-wise, where we live, etc. And I think what the article maybe doesn't name so clearly is this actually proved that we weren't so different. It just used to be true for everyone, and it was true of the church. This, I do think, the thing I really loved about the article was, okay, like, step up, like, do this thing that actually would be really good. I fear too often, as you just described, Sky, like, we pat ourselves in the back because of some of those statistics, when in reality, I do think it's just true of American culture in general, inside and outside of the church, that we used to have some good things about stability and community that we just have lost, that are really unnerving for a lot of people. They don't know kind of where to find that again, especially if they've decided, because of some of these other things, abuse in the church, especially with children or with women, you know, hypocrisy, leadership failures. If the church doesn't seem appealing at all, then, like, it doesn't really seem like, of course, it would have any of these other things that have changed throughout time in all kinds of institutions.
Yeah, so when you read further in the article, his prescription, or his argument is essentially the church has lowered the bar so much because it's trying to appeal to people, to make it easier for people to enter into the church. The church has adopted the values and models of the surrounding culture, which means the church is no different. So as the culture deteriorates into this atomized, workaholic driven kind of thing, so is the church. So there's no real appeal anymore for people to come in. So his argument is, rather than lowering the bar to engagement with the church, we actually need to raise the bar. We need to expect more from people and call them to more commitment and more groundedness and more volunteering and more mutuality and more sacrifice and take up your cross and all that. And on one level, I'm going, okay, I hear that, but here's the problem.
Totally.
We do have a leadership abuse problem in the church, and we do have toxicity, and I'm thinking of Scott McKnight's book on Tove and kind of the toxicity of a lot of the churches. So how do you raise the bar for people in their commitment to the church at the same time that fewer people trust the leaders of the church to use that power and influence in a healthy, life-giving way rather than an abusive? Like that's what I mean by perfect storm. I agree with him. Let's raise the bar, but you can't do it with unhealthy leaders and distrust.
Well, even those set of categories, more volunteering. Nope, that's not what the church is called to do.
Right.
More sacrifice. Nope. Those all of those things have been polluted because, I mean, the grand announcement of the church isn't how great the church is. And so the answer to your spiritual problems is get more involved in church, right? We've done that. And as far back as when we were, Caitlin, you're exempted from all of these references. But there was this big Willow Creek thing years ago that, oh my goodness, being more involved in church doesn't correlate to spiritual growth, as if that were some shock, For
a lot of people, it was, especially church leaders.
Yes, yeah. I'm kind of dismissing it a little bit in the sense of it exposed the great lie driving church growth movements.
Yeah.
And for those of us who have been skeptical a little bit of those, it was like, well, yeah, I mean, that's, Jesus never invited us into be more involved in our churches. And so I'm with you on this in the sense that there is a greater degree of something we're being invited into, but I wouldn't associate that necessarily with the institution of church life. You know what I mean?
So what are we then invited into? To be more committed to and more sacrificial toward and more caring of, like, what is that thing, if not the church?
Yeah, so I'm even struggling with the words you're using. To be committed to sacrifice for, like, I have this, I'm like, when Jesus describes the kingdom, he uses the carry your cross image, but he also uses the image of a dude who finds treasure in his field and is like, with great joy, sells everything and grabs it. Like, I don't think me as a church person do a good enough job promoting a vision of the kingdom that is bigger than being involved in church. And as a result, the best thing we do, or the thing we think we do, is to make church more attractive. And that is precisely the thing that nobody wants.
Is it the case that, I've written a lot about this, and it's in my book, What If Jesus Was Serious About the Church?
Oh boy.
Ding, ding, ding.
Come on.
But is it that we've just confused what we mean by church? Because I know I throw up a little bit in my mouth when I hear people use the word church, when what they're really referring to is the 501c3 nonprofit organization with its budgets and buildings and staff and all that. You need to be more sacrificial or committed to that thing, versus when they mean church as the community of people, women and men and children redeemed by Jesus, who are living in communion with him and for the care of the world. Like that, I get. But I think where our suspicions go up is when you want me to give more and sacrifice more and donate more to this 501c3 nonprofit that's being led by these people whose egos are all caught up in making sure it grows.
Yeah.
Is that the issue?
That's one, I would say that's a symptom of the issue.
Okay.
Caitlin, go.
Yep. You're ready to jump. I can tell.
I think the other thing is, and I really liked the article, partially because the last couple years of my life, I've been at a church where I am deeply involved in lots of areas, and it has been incredible. And so I felt like, yeah, actually, we had an experience a couple years ago in the membership class at my church where some people were pretty skeptical that some people were going to become members because they were being asked, a lot was being asked of them. Like, it really was a serious commitment. And I've just been surprised by how many young people are like, that's actually very attractive to me, that signing up for this thing is a big commitment. But I think part of what Mike is getting at that I think is really important is not just the institution versus the redeemed people of God, but also, is it about programs and like signups for things and just like commit like by sheer force of will? Or is it, I belong to you and you belong to me, and I sacrifice for you because we're part of a family, and you make demands on me and I make demands on you. It's reciprocal and it's rooted in love, and that's actually a joy even when it's hard. Like, I've been so frustrated. My church has done a good job over the last couple of years of like really pushing being involved in the children's ministry because we haven't had enough volunteers. And I used to work in children's ministry, so like every church I've ever preached in, I've made a note about like, help with the kids, y'all, because I was sick of calling people and begging them to come help with the
Right.
kids. But part of what I'm frustrated by in general, my church does this better, I think, but lots of people do this where it's like, come on, guys, pull your weight, come be with the kids. And I'm like, that should be described as an opportunity to, in love, be a part of the family of God. And I just wish that we both actually believed that that was true, that the ways that we care for one another and sacrifice for one another and are committed to one another sometimes was painful. Like, it does hurt you sometimes. Also, it's joyful. Like, it's a desire that I have that's born out of love for one another supernaturally. Like, the Holy Spirit supplies this to us. And I wish that that was more of how we described it and more of how people experienced it. People don't experience it enough that way. But I do think how we talk about it changes it. Like, just a couple months ago, we had a potluck after church, and one of my pastor's kids, her dad, who's not the pastor, was carrying her and was trying to get the 4 other kids food. And I was like, please let me hold the baby. Like, I would love to hold the baby. So he gave me the baby. After he got the rest of the kids' food, he came back and he was like, oh, I want to grab her back from you because I saw that you were in the nursery this morning. So like, you've done your duty. Like, you don't need to hold her anymore. And I was like, do you not understand that your need meets my joy at this exact place? Like, I would love nothing more than to hold this baby, and you need someone to hold this baby. Like, it doesn't always work out that way in a broken, fallen world, that the joy and the need doesn't always meet, but like, that's the miracle of the church, I think, as God intended it to be. We fail to meet that all the time. But I wish that this call to like sacrifice and commitment was rooted in love and joy, because that's what I have experienced. I haven't always experienced it. I've experienced the places where it goes horribly wrong. So I feel for the people who are going, I can't even imagine it being joyful and loving and good. But I've also experienced it being joyful and loving and good. And I want that for people. And it involves commitment, but it is rooted in love.
Can I jump on that, or
Go
did you
for it.
have were you going a different way?
No. Go for it.
What Caitlin, you're describing perfectly what I was trying to fish around for. When my wife and I both come from divorced families, and so when we got married, that was a very intimidating thing for us. How do you be faithful? How do you do this? And about 2 years into our marriage, we met a family that was across the street. They have 8 kids, 2 boys, 2 girls, 2 boys, 2 girls. And they, for whatever reason, they adopted us. And we spent, I don't know, the next 10 years spending every holiday imaginable with them. And they filled our imagination of, yes, the sacrifice, no question. We saw the tiredness, the frustration, the irritation, and we saw the joy, the laughter, the thing. And so was it sacrifice for my wife and I to work towards kind of claiming that for ourselves? It was and it wasn't, right? It's not like we weren't unaware of the sacrifices and issues, but the compelling nature of the vision was something that we'd never experienced, and it was easy then to sacrifice for. And what I'm saying is, particularly, I mean, I look at the preaching of the church and I just see nothing more than self-help, hustle culture, and how to improve yourself. And it just makes me infuriated with how shallow and lame that is. Because there is so much beauty to call people to and invite people in that you don't have to push for church programs to make that happen. So anyway, I'm sorry, Sky. Thanks
No.
for getting that up.
You guys are riffing on exactly where I was hoping this conversation would go, because, and even your example of marriage, Mike, is like, one thing I've grown increasingly convinced of is that every good gift God has given us is made better with boundaries. And what I mean by that, for example, he's given us bodies, and the fact that we are incarnate and limited means we can't be everywhere and do everything at once, even though technology wants to give us that illusion. And when we just learn to accept that I'm here now in this place and be present, it's better.
That's good, Sky.
Marriage is a limitation, right? It's saying I'm going to commit to this person and a sexual relationship with this one person rather than all the other options that might be out there. And some people look at that going, oh, no, that's too limiting. That's too confining. But when you embrace that limitation, it actually makes life better. And I think what this article is getting at is American culture is giving so many options to us to do so many things, to advance our careers, to be involved in a bazillion different activities and sports and everything. And people want to have all those options open to them. And it feels like, well, if I commit myself to one community, to this church community, that's going to limit me. And that's a sacrifice that I don't want to make. But when we realize the beauty that comes with that sacrifice, the benefit that comes with that sacrifice, the chance for my great joy to be met in someone else's need, as Caitlin described, like, it sells itself because it's so good and wonderful. I think what we get hung up on is, in a lot of churches I've been a part of, it sounds like you too, Mike, the message we hear is not one of the beauty of life and commitment to others. What we hear is how great it's going to be when you help us advance this institution.
Oh, so
Right?
good, Scott.
If
Yes.
you volunteer in this way, or if you give your money here, or if you give up some of your free time to come do this, it'll grow our church or grow the mission, whatever. And after a while, you realize, I think these guys are using me. I don't think they really love me. I think they want to use me. And on top of that, the things we are called to in the world, the vocations that God has given us, are never acknowledged or validated.
Oh,
Right.
so
The other
good.
relationships we have in our community stuff are never verified and blessed. It's just, what are you doing for the 501c3?
Totally.
And so I think the answer here is it's not raising the bar necessarily, but it's focusing on the right one.
Yes.
It's not the institutional bar, it's the communal bar, and acknowledging their sacrifice there, but there's blessing in the commitment to those relationships. Does that
That'll
work?
preach. That'll preach.
Yeah.
One of the things that's been so revolutionary in my own learning has been the idea that the role of the church in the world is to be faithful, not effective. Like, the goal is an impact. The goal is fidelity.
Yeah.
And that's just such a different, I mean, I've had to reorient everything about what I know about preaching and teaching and leading and meetings, and even how I understand church around a new axis. And that's exactly kind of what you're getting at, to realize the goal of my church isn't to reach the world. The goal of my church is to grow in the fruit of the Spirit and to become more faithful to Jesus' life together. And if God uses that and draws people to that, fantastic. But that's not our measure of success, you know? And I know that's all easy to say, and I've heard it, you know, from Eugene Peterson ages past. But when you encounter that, the reality of it yourself, you just can, I just look back and see how hollow the pursuit was, you know? And that you're right, that the church was there to serve the pastor rather than the pastor kind of serve in the church. And all of that can be cliche, but it's actually really true in the American church. There are a bunch of us who simply are using the church to cover our own ego needs, to advance our own personal ambitions. And
Caitlin, before I give you the last word, I
Oh,
just hearing
yes.
Mike share that, it's like I feel like, Mike, you and I have both been through the ringer of church world and have had to be reprogrammed in that. And Caitlin, though you are younger than us, you have been through the ringer of church world and have had to be reprogrammed. You sounds like you have found a very good, healthy place. And I'm really, what gives me hope is you were able to go through that process much younger than we were, which makes me think maybe this is accelerating and people are coming to find a healthier vision of church earlier than it used to be. And that means maybe there's hope in this. So as a person who's in a community that you seem super excited about and has been good for your health and flourishing in faith, give us a final word from this article for you about what gives you hope.
Yeah, you know, I'm imagining someone listening and going, yeah, I mean, I am really attracted to the idea of a smaller, close-knit community that is committed to one another and belongs to one another and cares for one another. And I just don't have that. Like, that's just not the reality of the place that I'm in. And I'm just really sorry. Like, it is true that it is just hard to find that, and that's heartbreaking. For people who are going, is there anything I can do? What I would encourage people to do is, one is, I mean, this sounds cliche, but I actually just do believe God is real and working in the world. You should ask for it. Like, I feel like I was just ridiculously blessed by kind of falling into this community that I'm in after years of really painful, difficult church experience. And I really think that was just an utter gift from God. I didn't engineer that myself. It's not because I'm a good person. I didn't do it better than anyone else. I think it was a gift from God, and I would encourage people to ask for it, like really boldly, ask for that kind of community. But the other thing I would say is this is built by really small things. Like, this is not built by going, all right, we figured it out. Let's do a really, common purse community. Let's start a program. Let's start a denomination. Let's start an institute. Like, that is not how this happens. This happens by you going, there's a church down the street from me. It's not perfect. I'm going to bring a casserole after someone has a surgery. I'm going to show up and babysit someone's kid. I'm going to invite them into my home so they know me. I'm going to ask things of people. I could take an Uber to the airport at 4:00. I'm going to call and see if someone will take me. Like, I'm going to ask for what I need, and I'm going to give when people need. And that's not dramatic or flashy, and you probably won't write a best-selling book about it. But you also will be, as Mike said, just regular faithful. And over time, it won't be perfect. It won't be this shining example of faithfulness all the time. But I do think it's those small things that even if the church doesn't completely change into that, you'll have built the kind of relationships that are reflective, I think, of what God intended for us to live in community like.
Amen. Amen. All right, everybody, we are going to have the links to these articles in the show notes. Mike, thank you for being with us, and be sure to check out Voxology and the amazing content that you guys are cranking out. You've just done a whole long series in Revelation, which has been brilliant. What do you have coming up?
Well, there's a woman in the kingdom who is writing, she's got a book coming out called The Bible and the Ballot, or The Ballot and the Bible.
Oh, it sounds
I don't know.
so
It's
boring.
It's but she's so brilliant. She wrote this other book called Liturgy of Politics, which I wasn't sure about. So, Sky, that I don't know if you know this, but that's Caitlin.
Oh,
and
don't I
I
feel
know.
stupid?
I know.
I don't have all the books behind me, so you couldn't know.
Oh! So yes, smack dab. We've done like 13 weeks in Revelation, and we're through chapter 3. So we're killing it. Killing it.
It actually
right now.
is amazing. It's really, really super informative. And
Thank you, Sky.
I have yet to listen to an episode of your show where I'm like, I think Mike's an idiot. Like, I don't think I've ever really disagreed with you.
Well,
Which
that
says
shows
something.
You haven't listened to many, so that's.
Oh, I have.
No,
I have.
Bro, I appreciate that. Caitlin, I'm waiting for your endorsement of our podcast too. Just when was the last time you listened to it?
Well, it's not only really good, and I do love it, but also I didn't know you were doing this Revelation series, and I'm trying to teach Revelation at my church, so now I'm going to go listen to all of them.
Oh, Lord.
There you go.
No, I'm
well,
sorry,
you're
I
going to need a
wasn't
lot of
pushing for
time,
that.
Caitlin, because he's in chapter 3 after 13 weeks. Hey, everybody, check out Mike's
Thank you.
show. Mike is also one of our Holy Post pundits, and we have a whole, 17 of them?
Yes.
Amy Peeler, Dr. Amy Peeler from Wheaton College just wrote this fantastic review of the
It was
Barbie
great.
movie. And Caitlin just did an interview with her about it, which is going to be exclusively for our Holy Post Plus subscribers. So go to holypost.com, check out the Holy Post Plus program. You can find out all about it. You get access to tons of great stuff, including that great Amy Peeler interview. The article is available to everybody on our website, so check that out. We're going to have an interview coming up in a minute, but go to our website, join the conversation around this episode. Love to hear what you guys think, and we will see you soon.
This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Faithful Counseling. Life is not easy. Relationships are hard. Parenting is hard. Being the child of parents is hard. I've found a trained therapist can be a wonderful sounding board for working through the ups and downs of living in a fallen world as fallen people. Faithful Counseling is a Christian counseling service with more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states, with access by video or phone sessions or even chat and text, with expertise in depression, stress, anxiety, trauma, family conflicts, and more. It's more affordable than traditional counseling, and financial aid is available for those who qualify. We all need to talk to someone sometime, and Faithful Counseling can help. Continue growing into the best version of yourself. Visit faithfulcounseling.com/holypost and get the professional, faith-based counseling that you need. They've even got a special offer for our listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. Thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode.
Today's show is being sponsored by Caldera Lab. The last time I checked, I have skin. In fact, I have a lot of skin. So why do skincare companies act like only women have skin? And why are skincare products almost always exclusively designed for them? Like when my skin gets really dry and irritated, especially in the winter, I look around my house for something and everything I find is full of perfumes and daffodils. It's obvious these products were not created for me. But there's finally a company that is designing skincare products for men. Caldera Lab is the leader in men's skincare, and their products are fantastic. They have stuff you'd expect like soap and shaving gel, which I've been using every day and love. But they also have a slate of other skincare products like the Clean Slate, a face wash to begin and end your day with, and a moisturizer that hydrates your skin, but, and this is the key, it leaves a matte finish. When you've got a scalp as big as mine, the last thing you want is shiny, oily skin. On a sunny day, I could blind somebody. That's why the matte finish moisturizer is the answer. And Caldera Lab has a skin serum for men with 3.4 million antioxidant units in each drop. What does that mean? I have no idea, but I guess it's supposed to protect your skin from damage. But here's the point. Men, you can wash, shave, and take care of your skin without smelling like a florist shop. And right now, you can get 20% off with our code HOLYPOST at calderalab.com. That's 20% off at calderalab.com by using the code HOLYPOST. Last year, back on episode 510, Caitlin interviewed Washington Post opinion columnist Christine Emba about her book, Rethinking Sex. In that book, Emba explored the unintended consequences of the sexual revolution for women. While she recognized problems with the purity culture found in many Christian communities, she said that the consent-alone sexual ethic that's taken over much of our culture is extremely damaging to women as well. If you haven't listened to that interview, I really recommend going back and doing that. But Christine Emba is now back exploring another side of gender, sexuality, and culture, specifically the crisis among men. She wrote a lengthy article last month titled, "Men Are Lost. Here's a Map Out of the Wilderness." Although Emba supports the remarkable progress made by women and the feminist movement over the last 50 years, she says the crisis among men in America is very real and it needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, those who appear to be taking this issue seriously on the far right are also those offering the worst possible solutions, while progressives on the left are reluctant to address the issue at all, fearing that if they help men, they'll be perceived as betraying women. I found her article to be incredibly illuminating and well reported, and I was grateful to have her back to talk about it on our show. Here's my conversation with Christine Emba. Christine Emba, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Thanks for having me again.
Again, yeah, for those who didn't catch your last appearance, you were on episode 510. Caitlin interviewed you about your book, Rethinking Sex. I didn't read your book. I read a lot of articles and interviews you did about the book and was absolutely fascinated by it. And I hope people will go back and listen to that episode because it was great. But we have you back on because you wrote a piece recently, a lengthy piece in the Washington Post where you're a columnist called Men Are Lost. Here's a Map Out of the Wilderness. So let's start with this. You talk about in the article that kind of anxiety over masculinity is not exactly a new problem. For 200 years, Americans have been saying there's a crisis of masculinity. What's different right now? Why is the rhetoric that there's a crisis in masculinity, perhaps, why should it be taken more seriously than it had been 50 years ago or 100 years ago?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so yes, in the article I talk about how America has had sort of a recurring fascination, sounds positive, and it's not
Right.
it's not quite positive, this fear that America's men are growing soft in some way. But I think what's happening right now is that it's not just rhetoric. I think the evidence is becoming clearer that this is the case. We have the hard numbers. And also I think that the response to masculinity's supposed failing in the US is becoming more clear and perhaps more dangerous. So, I mean, first let's talk about the numbers and the evidence. We
Right.
can say all that we want to about, how men are lost and have in the past. But if you look at the stats today, there's just concrete evidence that men are falling behind women. So if you look at the number of men who graduate from college, say, for every 100 women who graduate with a bachelor's degree, only 74 men do. If you look at sort of how healthy men are in a sense. Deaths of despair, this phenomenon that was identified by Case and Deaton. Deaths of despair are deaths by suicide, drug overdose, or alcohol related death. And for every 4 deaths of despair in this country, 3 of them are men. You talk to men and do the polling about loneliness, about the number of friends that they have. A high number of men report feeling extremely lonely and not having any close friends. And then you can kind of just look at how our society has changed. I think one of the ways that men used to feel secure in American society, at least, is that we had just sort of a strong layer of kind of labor oriented, strength often oriented jobs, factory jobs, union jobs. In the past 20 to 30 years, a ton of those have just gone away. Based on globalization, they've been shipped overseas, and we've moved towards a more credential, soft skills heavy environment, which tends to favor women. We had the feminist movement, which, as I talk about in my book, and I'll say here, I think was a very good thing. But we've spent, several decades now thinking very hard about what the role of women is in society, how women can be included in our economy and our society and do better. And it doesn't quite feel like we've had the same level of thoughtfulness about what the role of men is in a changing society. And then I think also on sort of more progressive sides, often the flip side to the women are great, we need to do more for women, is a sort of men are bad, men are toxic, masculinity is toxic, we need fewer men, men are trash, which is not very welcoming.
Let's talk about responses to this, because one of the best parts of this article is looking at the difference between the way conservatives are responding to the masculinity crisis and the way progressives are responding or failing to respond to the masculinity crisis. Let's talk about conservative responses first. As you interviewed people and kind of looked at the landscape, what were some themes that popped up on the right that you found intriguing or maybe disturbing?
Yeah, I would describe it as both. And I guess this is also to sort of your first question, why is this important now? This feeling that men might be lost has always been happening, but the responses are very palpable in this moment.
Yeah.
And so I think on the conservative side, I think first of all, we can just acknowledge that conservatives have always tended to be sort of more clear about the fact that sexuality and gender, gender roles exist. There is something called male and something called female, and like we should talk about that. And I think they have used that sort of sense of, you know, clarity about what those roles mean to put forward like very, very clear propositions and potential solutions to the masculinity problem, of, I would say, better and worse quality. And in politics, especially, I think that conservative politicians, I'm thinking right now of, Senator Josh Hawley, say, or J.D. Vance, all of these guys who are now, all of a sudden, over the past couple of years, have begun speaking about how liberals hate men, want to destroy men, elites are ruining masculinity. They're using this sense of discomfort that's very palpable in American men to kind of bring them over to the right, to say like, we understand what you're feeling and we have the solution, and the solution is to blame liberals or to blame feminists,
Right.
and to vote for me because I will put you back into the place of respect that you once had. And I think that that's not good for our politics. That's not good for our future because a good masculinity has to be defined as more than just being anti femininity. And also, if the solution is, well, men, you should be angry, and we're going to fix it by bringing all of the mining jobs back. That's just not going to happen. That's not a real solution. The solution can't be to go back in time to the 1950s to a place where, where you can live the life of your grandfather, because that's just not possible today. So in a sense, they're offering both a false solution and a victim complex, basically, telling men to feel even worse about themselves and blame someone else.
So, one of the things you highlight in that section where you talk about the response from the conservative end of the spectrum, two positive things you mentioned. First, they're at least empathetic to the men who are feeling in crisis. They're acknowledging the reality of that angst. And two, in their better moments, they are pro male. They are trying to be helpful. So my question is, where do you see, when does that empathy and pro masculinity transition into misogyny? Where does it go? When does it spoil?
Yeah. No, that's also a great question. So, I was just talking about kind of the conservative political response to the masculinity question, which has its own problems, but as you say, does at least sort of seem to have a sense of empathy and some something of a solutions oriented approach, even though the solutions that are proffered aren't very strong ones. I think, however, what I'm really concerned about and what I talk a lot about in the piece is, I would say, conservative adjacent, or conservative leaning, what I call manfluencers. People like, say, Andrew Tate, or, even Jordan Peterson on his worst days, sometimes Joe Rogan. These are guys who align themselves with sort of the conservative political movement, but often proffer sort of much worse solutions to the masculinity crisis. And I think Jordan Peterson is actually a kind of specific sort of sui generis person, because he really started off as sort of the example of someone who was empathetic towards the struggles of young men. That's why the book, 12 Rules for Life, was a runaway bestseller. Seemed to really care about how do we talk to young men and help them grow into sort of better people, but has increasingly become politicized. And then on the far end, you have people like Andrew Tate, the figure of Bronze Age pervert, a very online figure who wrote this book about masculinity, called the Bronze Age Manifesto, that is conservative in that it was picked up by a lot of young conservatives online. It was written about in conservative book reviews and became kind of assigned reading for all of the young men in the Trump administration. And the problem with these guys is what they proffer about masculinity is sympathy, yes, like an understanding that, like, yes, you, a man, may feel bad about your place in the world. The way to fix it is to really beat women down and not respect them.
Right.
Is to show your masculinity through sort of consumption and amorality. Like Andrew Tate just talks about how many cars he has and how much sex he can have with random women. And in fact, right now is under arrest in Romania for allegedly running a sex trafficking ring. Um, you know, the Bronze Age pervert, a figure, like talks about how men need to regain their sense of masculinity by getting strong and working out, but also by being really racist, and demeaning other races as inferior and saying that women are inferior and need to be ignored or used, but just that. And so this is a response to masculinity that is just really ugly and really amoral. And while it is sort of empathetic, the solutions that it suggests, or the approach to life that it suggests, is really hideous, actually, antisocial and bad for us.
Yeah, just the name Bronze Age pervert. There's nothing positive about
No,
any. No one wants
it
to be a
doesn't.
pervert, and I don't know anybody who thinks the Bronze Age was an idealized moment in human history. But just on its face, it's a dramatic overreaction. I want to talk about, you mentioned social identity theory, and for those unfamiliar with it, it's a sense of when one of your core identities feels attacked, the instinct is to then double or triple down on that identity and take it to its extreme. As you were writing about this in the context of gender, I'm currently reading John Meacham's newer biography of Abraham Lincoln. And he talks about, obviously, slavery was a massive component of that story. With the rise of abolitionism in the North in the early 1800s, there was a subsequent rise or transformation of the way the South taught about slavery. Whereas in the Revolutionary era's generation, the South obviously was standing by slavery, but they were willing to make concessions. Even in the Constitution, there was a willingness to end the slave trade by 1808. There was an agreement not to expand territories with slavery. There was also an agreement that they wouldn't remove slavery from the South. But it was sort of seen as the South wanted slavery to be tolerated. But by the 1820s and 30s, it transformed into the South arguing slavery was actually a God-ordained good and righteous institution that should expand to the whole continent. And so Meacham's trying to explain why did that happen, and his argument is essentially the same thing you're arguing here of social identity theories. As the North started being more and more critical of slavery, the South decided we need to be more and more positive on slavery. Is that's what's happening here with this masculinity movement on the right? Is the perception is progressives are attacking masculinity, so we need to not just defend masculinity, but we're going to defend the most heinous examples of masculinity and call them virtuous and good. So is one side just feeding off the dysfunction of the other?
I mean, I actually think that's a great analysis, and I would say yes. So, we have unfortunately many examples of kind of bad masculinity or bad responses to the masculinity crisis on the right. Two that also come to mind politically are sort of Tucker Carlson and his End of Men documentary, and
Right.
the Proud Boys, this sort of group of men founded by Gavin McInnes, that was supposed to be supposedly a masculine fraternity, a brotherhood where men teach their other men to be men, I guess. And those were people who ended up storming the Capitol on January 6th. And I think both of those, Tucker Carlson started talking about men and the masculinity crisis as a response to, hearing or thinking that he was hearing progressives and liberals denigrate masculinity or say that there is no problem. The Proud Boys were ostensibly created as a response to progressives and feminists on the left going overboard and saying that, men aren't a real thing, or that there's no such thing as masculinity and that men should be more like women. And their response was like, no, men should be more like men, which looks like being really violent and rioting in the streets and committing crimes in Washington, D.C. But yeah, it is that. It's a response to, I think this was the second part of the question that you asked, the liberal progressive response to the masculinity crisis, which in the piece, I suggest that if the right seems to be recognizing that there is a masculinity crisis and is talking about it openly and in some ways maybe trying to profit off of it, the left, for understandable reasons, seems to not want to either admit that there's a crisis or talk about it. Instead of saying, oh, we need to, figure out what positive masculinity is, often the response seems to be, like, there's no such thing as masculinity. We should just all be good people. And men, stop complaining. Masculinity actually is toxic, and maybe we should be getting rid of it, which is not appealing to men. And then also promotes this pushback from the right.
Yeah, okay, two things there. One is going back to the conservative response. It feels like in an attempt to justify and celebrate masculinity, the model of masculinity they're celebrating is like what a 15-year-old thinks masculinity is, right? Hypersexualized, hyper-aggressive, unbound by responsibility. Whereas maybe what we need is a 50-year-old's view of masculinity rather than a 15-year-old's, one that's tempered by wisdom and experience and responsibility. But then getting to the progressive view, I want to read you back something you wrote because I thought it was so well said. Many young men feel their difficulties are often dismissed out of hand as whining from a patriarchy that they don't feel a part of. For young men in particular, the assumption of a world built to serve their sex doesn't align with their lived experience, where girls out-achieve them from pre-K to postgraduate studies and men are trash, in quotes, is an acceptable joke. So young men are struggling, but if they're in a more progressive environment, they don't feel like they can open up about that because it's not allowed. And one other thing that came out really, which I had not read before, I don't know why, maybe I'm just too isolated. But in 2018, you report that the American Psychological Association, in its guidelines for psychological practice with men, declared that traditional masculinity, marked by stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression, is on a whole harmful, and that these standards are damaging to mental and physical health. Basically, the American Psychological Association saying masculinity is unhealthy. I
Right.
mean, those kinds of declarations are going to trigger people on the right to double down, triple down on that ridiculous stereotype of masculinity. So, is the problem on the left this view that gender advancement is a zero-sum game, and if women are going to advance, which is you've said in your book and elsewhere has been wildly effective and successful over the last half century, for women to advance, we need to not care about the struggles of men? Is that the false assumption that's carrying the left right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a false assumption that both sides feel, but in this situation does seem to be really prominent on the left. That yeah, that all politics is a zero-sum game. That advancement is a zero-sum game. I think there's sort of a fear on the left that okay, well, women have advanced, but that advancement is actually still pretty fragile. You know, we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic women just dropping out of the workforce. There's a sort of fear that if we suddenly turn our attention to men, are we just giving up on women now? Are we not going to have any more space to talk about women in the future? And I think that's not true. I think that, you know, we can do two things at once. We can hold two things in our head at once. And that in fact, the success of women is related to the success of men and vice versa, because we're both in contact with each other. Society is really kind of built on relationship between the sexes. But for whatever reason, that zero sum thinking is really common politically. I also think that there is a sort of second underlying fear that if we say that, you know, there is something good about masculinity specifically, about being a man, or if we associate certain traits with masculinity, say, you know, leadership or competitiveness, we are also somehow taking those away from women, or we're actually sort of reverse imaging those onto women, and that could be bad. So if we say that leadership seems to be a masculine trait, are we saying that women are followers? You know, if we say that competitiveness is a masculine trait, are women just sort of like weak nurturers who don't do anything? And there's almost a fear of backlash. And so in some ways, a sort of gender neutrality of we should just all be good people is feels a little bit safer in this moment. And then, you know, finally, I think there's also just an associational problem, like a branding problem in a way, because the question of masculinity and sort of manhood has been taken up often by these really aggressive, fringy, often far right figures. You know, the Tucker Carlsons and Andrew Tates of the
Right.
world. I think sometimes on the left there's a little bit of a fear. And I talked to Richard Reeves, who I quote in the piece about this, that like if you start talking about masculinity and seem too sympathetic to men, there's like a sort of, are you are
Right.
you one of those guys? Are you secretly a men's rights activist? Like, we're a little suspicious. What's going on here? And so
Yeah.
a lot of progressives just don't want to talk about it, don't want to be part of it.
So this is another kind of tangential example, but for years on this show and elsewhere, I've been talking about what's happened to the evangelical movement politically and its takeover by conspiracy theories and QAnon and some of the more extreme MAGA voices on the right. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because so many church leaders and pastors have refused to talk about politics. They think that talking about politics is somehow ungodly, it's inappropriate for the church, whatever. And through their silence, they have created a vacuum. And the voices that have stepped in who claim to be Christian tend to be really crazy voices on the extreme right or conspiracy theories or MAGA or whatever. And so people in the church who don't hear their leaders talking about the Christian a Christian view of political engagement end up going to those crazy voices. And it feels like the same thing's happening here, where more thoughtful, perhaps moderate or even progressive voices are silent about the crisis of masculinity. People who are feeling the crisis, the only voices they are hearing are from the extreme right. And that vacuum has created a bigger problem than if there had been a thoughtful engagement. Because so many people on the left are afraid, like you said, of being accused of supporting the patriarchy or not being feminist or not caring about the rights and needs of women. You quote a 19-year-old University of Florida student, a young man, and he said, "I feel like there's a lot of room to be proudly feminine, but there's not, in my opinion, the same room to be proudly masculine." And you quoted a number of other people, young men that you interviewed in the article, who feel like they don't know where to go to have these conversations because no one's talking about it. In the time we have left, I do want to pivot toward solutions. And this is you admit this is a really difficult part of your research and article, and few people want to talk concretely about solutions because of all the pitfalls you just mentioned. But one thing that comes up consistently is the need for male mentors or father figures in the lives of younger men. You talk about how throughout many cultures, the transition from boyhood to manhood is usually ushered in by a father figure or other men. In a way, and you don't get into this, I was talking to a friend of mine who's an anthropologist, and he pointed me to some other articles. Like, it's interesting that girls becoming women have a clear biological marker
Yeah.
of when that happens. Their bodies change in a way that is unmistakable. Boys, it's not as clear. I mean, puberty happens, but it's not as definitive that you are now a man. And so throughout cultures, there have been rituals of transition and marks of passage that enter boys into manhood. But so many fewer boys are growing up with their fathers than in the past. Talk about what you uncovered in your interviews with young men and others, and how the absentee father thing may be playing into this crisis.
Yeah, I think that's really key. I mean, so to go back a little bit to your question of the vacuum, I think that assessment is exactly right. So one of the sorry, the most rewarding and interesting things about reporting out this piece was that I really did just go around and talk to a lot of young men about their visions of masculinity, about what their worries or what they were looking for. And this was sort of the thing. There's a sense, and I feel like this happens more on the progressive side, that, you know, everyone should be whatever they want to be, just be a good person. We don't want to have something strict that we call masculinity because some people won't fit and that's hard for them. And that's very
Right.
true. But so many of the young men I spoke to were just like, no, I don't know how to be a man, and I just want someone to tell me how to do it. Like I just need some sort of model for how to be. And they're looking for that. And if the left isn't providing any, but the right is providing something, it may not be a good something, but in the competition between nothing and something, something is always going to win. Something is going to fill
Right.
that vacuum, and it unfortunately is these bad influencers. But one of the reasons I think why young men seem to be casting around so much is exactly what you say, this role modeling problem. So there's one young man who I quote in the piece who I was talking to, and he told me, you know, I didn't have a great relationship with my father, who has since died. And when I look around at my friends, like I feel like I can count on one hand the number of male friends I know who either have their father around or have a good relationship with their father. And that's who we thought we would learn from, but there's no one there. There are no models there. So what do we do? Who are we supposed to look to? And this young man said that actually he became friends with a priest who was like the chaplain at his school, who kind of took him under his wing and like taught him how to dress and like encouraged him to like go out on dates and learn how to like make a meal for a girl. And like this sort of just one-on-one relational mentoring is, he says, really taught him how to be a man. But that was kind of a one-off, right? It was sort of a random encounter. And I think one of the issues that we're seeing in our society is that there just don't seem to be as many men around who are open to and willing to be mentors in that way, to like actively go out of their way to take a younger guy under their wing. And also, and this I think feels somewhat controversial right now to say, is that there are fewer male spaces. So one statistic that's interesting is just the sheer lack of male teachers and male leaders in school. And so one academic I talked to was like, think about being a young man. You know, you grow up in a single parent home, which is very common at this point. You go through like a public school system. Your interactions with the medical system are normal. You probably are never going to have a male teacher. You will probably never see a male nurse. You the Boy Scouts are co-ed. You know, like sports teams because they're so or school sports teams because they're significantly fewer male teachers now also tend to be coached by women. So, you know, you just may not have anyone there. And this is a really hard problem to solve because you can't mandate relationship, right? Like you can't pass a law that's like every man needs to adopt a younger
Right.
man and tell him who to be.
Right.
You can't mandate a father for people. So while those roles are really important, it's unclear where we go. And I do think that one of the solutions is both young men kind of acknowledging that and seeking out mentors, but also older men who are in kind of a more secure place in their lives being open to like the guys in their church who kind of are running around and don't have someone for them, or like young men in their community.
Yeah, mentioning that young man you interviewed who went to a priest who kind of on a one-off level mentored him in some basic skills of young adulthood. It used to be congregations
Right.
helped people, especially those who maybe didn't have a two-parent household or others. Congregations became a place where people mingled cross-generationally, cross-gender, and built those relationships. But as that is diminishing increasingly, we are losing yet another institution where that could happen, where those organic relationships of mentoring might happen. Before we go, I mean, there's a lot to worry about here. Any examples you have, even small ones, where you think there's hope, that there's a model that could work? I know you interviewed Scott Galloway, and I think he's the one who said, hey, we need older men to just step up and do
Yeah.
this work of finding young men. And I agree entirely. But is there anyone out there that is programmatically or scaling in any way an effort to do this that you are encouraged by?
Tough question. I mean, Scott Galloway's podcast is really sort of often about this topic, and Richard Reeves, who wrote this book of Boys and Men, is setting up a new like initiative, think tank foundation just on the problems of boys and men. I would say that I'm heartened on I do think that this is on some level like kind of an individual level problem that has to be solved by individual relationships between boys and men. And one of the things that I was really heartened by was just the response to this piece. So it got in 3 days like 10,500 comments. But more than that, there was a call out embedded in the piece where I asked people to sort of write in to me and tell me who their ideal of masculinity was and why, or if they didn't have one. And often those call out boxes can be like kind of hit or miss. But this one, I'm going through the responses today. I got like 400 responses, and they were all so thoughtful, and often from older men, like looking back on their lives and being like, huh, who was it for me? And one of the things that I found really interesting was that, contra the idea that masculinity isn't a real thing or that masculinity is toxic, there were just a number of positive traits that kept cropping up and, you know, reoccurring, and a suggestion that actually maybe now that the conversation has started, we can talk about the fact that, hey, maybe actually masculinity and manhood is a real thing and it is good. And there are sort of character based ways of being a man that we should emphasize and talk about openly and move forward from there. You know, it doesn't have to be just aggression, but it could be like protecting the people in your community, your partner, the people you love. It doesn't have to be just about acquisition of money in some way. Like providing means just like, providing for your family, like getting good at your work or your job or your hobbies, having a moral code, and just like being an honorable person was something that came up over and over again. And it suggests to me that maybe we're maybe approaching a sort of tipping point in the conversation where we can begin to talk openly about like what a positive masculinity would look like. Not a far right one or sort of a far left progressive version, but like just what are real men and what is good about that and what can we encourage and talk about openly. So I don't know, I'm hoping that individual people maybe have been sort of pushed to do that by this piece, and that gives me some hope.
Well, that's part of the reason I wanted to talk to you about it, because I thought the piece was so excellent. I'm grateful for the reporting. And it's just sobering, because after reading the piece, I didn't need to be convinced that there was a crisis of masculinity. I think I've seen that enough. But what was sobering about your piece was thinking about, if we don't address this, it's going to be bad for all of us, for everyone. I mean, to have a lot of untethered young men, especially, listening to very toxic messages and leading to things like Proud Boys and misogyny and racism and all these other things that are really stewing among that population because they don't have positive models, that threatens the entire structure of our society. And it's going to be bad for women. It's going to be bad for everybody. So your piece is incredibly important, hopefully, in getting more people, especially on the progressive left, to admit that we do have a problem here. We need to acknowledge it. We need to address it and not remain silent simply out of a zero-sum fear that it would take away from the advances of women. So, Christine, Emba, thank you so much for the thoughtfulness and all the work that went into this excellent article. We will post a link to it in our show notes. Hopefully more people will engage and maybe share more stories directly with you of their positive experience.
Yeah.
And hopefully this will call the people in churches and ministries that listen to our podcast often to really take more seriously the intentionality of matching young men with older men and celebrating positive views of good masculinity. Thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.